This is William O'Connell, and we're talking once again about the Kennedy assassination and the Warren Commission report. And our guest today is Josiah Thompson. Dr. Thompson is a professor of philosophy at Haverford College. He's been a student at Oxford University and the universities of Copenhagen and Yale. He's done a 2-year hitch in the in the Navy in 1958. That is when the Marines landed in Lebanon. He was an officer in the Navy. He commanded the UDT detachment charged with beach reconnaissance. He has a new scholarly work out entitled The Lonely Labyrinth, Kierkegaard's pseudonymous works, and which was published in the same month as 6 Seconds in Dallas, which is the book we'll be discussing this evening. So I should say welcome to KPFK, Dr. Thompson.
Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here.
Apropos of Kierkegaard, the only remembrance I had of him, inasmuch as my reading in philosophy was primarily directed at Thomism, the works of Berdyaev, and some of the commentaries of Maritain, I do remember one statement of Kierkegaard's that seems appropriate at this time, and I think it went something like this: I have not let go of my thoughts. I have not made my life comfortable. And that leads me to the question, why have isn't it true that it's apropos of the researchers on the Kennedy assassination? They refuse to let go of their thoughts. They refuse to lead a comfortable life. It's the happy passion of the philosopher and the activist at the same time. What is it that creates this, and how is it sustained?
I think that's a superb point, because the parallel between the Kierkegaardian obsession, Kierkegaard's obsession with ideas and with subjective truth, and the kind of obsession, and I think that's the correct word, for the projects and activities of the Kennedy researchers. I think it's very clever very acute to begin with that parallel, because I think by pointing out the obsessive quality and character of the psyche that engages in these researches, you point out on the one hand the lack of comfort that goes with that sort of obsession, the willingness to take hazard and danger, but on the other hand also the hazards and dangers that go with that. Because the danger of an obsession is, of course, that it becomes unmeasured, becomes unstructured and undisciplined by the canons of reason. And I think this tension between one's commitment to this task, to the solution of this almost religious mystery, at least it seems to have a religious flavor in the consciousness of many people who have investigated it. The contrast between that obsession and the necessity, while one is pursuing the solution of that mystery, to make one's project still measured and disciplined. Yes. I think that's the very center of the whole problem of any person who interests himself and engages in this kind of work. I felt it myself quite keenly on many occasions.
I concluded a 2-hour summary in November of 1967 on the Kennedy assassination, and I did point out at that time that many of the researchers, at the expense of vindictive personal insults, had, by this very obsession of theirs, enabled us to advance the dialogue on the Warren Commission report and the assassination to a point where now, thanks to their work, and to yours as well, of course, we've gained greater insights and greater knowledge of the case than we had, say, 2 or 3 years ago. But there has been a prevalent criticism, and it was voiced last year by Professor Bickel, whom I notice has given a rather encouraging review to your new book, 6 Seconds in Dallas, in a recent issue of the New Republic. But Professor Bickel of Yale had this stricture that he placed on the heads of the critics. He said that much of their research seemed to stem from a kind of New Left revisionism. And when M.S. Arnone of the Minority of One was in Los Angeles, I raised this question, and his reply was that indeed this was instead an ad hominem argument that Professor Bickel was advancing, and that it did not have substance. Yet it has been repeated, especially now with the publicity surrounding the Garrison probe. How would you reply, Dr. Thompson, to that kind of stricture?
I think the stricture is warranted. I think the stricture is warranted in many cases. It seems to me that the only way to reply to it is to point out that the ideal of the totally objective researcher is a totally irrelevant ideal to any existing human being. That any researcher who engages in a project which demands the sustained energy that this sort of project demands must be personally involved on the most primitive and basic level. So the fact that many of the critics of the Warren Report stand on the left rather than on the right, it seems to me that this is a fact. But again, it doesn't seem to me that this fact should reflect in any way on the conclusions that are drawn out of these researches. The problem is, of course, as one engages in this kind of research, to draw the line between what one would wish to be the case and what one sees very coolly and incisively is the case. And even more importantly, to not let one's wishes pull one's conclusions farther than the evidence warrants. And it seems to me that that problem has haunted almost all of the researches into the Kennedy assassination up to now. The problem of the unlimited.
Would you expound on that? Could you give us a few examples, perhaps?
Well, I heard on the radio coming over this evening that Jim Garrison, as part of his latest announcement of the subpoenas on 3 material witnesses, announced that the assassination was in fact a coup d'etat, a shift in power in this country, and that this was the proper ground for understanding it. Well, it seems to me this is an interesting theory, which may in fact turn out to be the case. But at the present time, I know of precious little evidence for it. And that unwillingness to distinguish between what sort of statements one can justify when one is questioned about them. I mean, what possibly could Jim Garrison reply if a very steely-eyed and cool investigative reporter said, "Now, Mr. Garrison, that's interesting rhetoric. Let's have a few facts. You say this is a coup d'etat. All right, a coup d'etat by whom? What plans were put in operation? How do you know of the existence of these plans?" Etc., etc., etc.
Yes.
And one could duplicate this sort of unlimited theorizing again and again and again. I think simply the critics have been guilty of theorizing without due regard to the limits of the evidence they were dealing with. And in many cases, this has served only to embarrass their efforts and the efforts of their colleagues.
Apropos of your efforts in 6 Seconds in Dallas, there are a number of new points that you make in the book. I alluded to not the book, but the article extracted from the book that had appeared in a issue of the Saturday Evening Post in November, and only since then have I had an opportunity to read the book itself, which I found very impressive. And I wonder if I could then address myself and we could address ourselves to some of the points you raise in the book. There was a terribly interesting discussion surrounding a Polaroid photograph taken by a bystander at the assassination by the name of Mary Moorman. Now, this had been treated before, I believe on one of my broadcasts, by Raymond Marcus, who concluded that there were certain human images in the background of this photo that might be. He did not say that they were assassins, but he said that they could be perhaps potential assassins, or that their existence should have been given cognizance by the commission, and that this should have been explored, and that we should have made an attempt to discover their identity. But in your book, I find a completely new human image, or the suggestion of a human image is perhaps is the better term, behind the stockade fence, where many people felt that a shot or shots were fired. How should one weigh your suggestion of a human image as opposed to Mr. Marcus's image?
Well, I think one should weigh the two claims with reference to the primitiveness of the evidence displayed. I believe, for example, that the number 5 man, which appears near the pergola in a Ben-Day negative developed here by David Lifton, and I believe this is part of Mr. Marcus's theory too. After I made an effort and succeeded in getting a copy made from Mary Moorman's original Polaroid print in Dallas, succeeded this winter in getting this copy, it turns out that man seems to, or that figure, apparent figure, seems to recede into the distance, seems to even disappear in the photograph. As one gets to two more primitive levels of evidence, in other words, away from a Ben-Day screen negative, down finally to the original photographic surface, which ultimately must produce or not produce any images whatsoever, it seems to me that most of these images seem to decay and even disappear. But that's perhaps not the most important element here in evaluating what's in this photograph. We do have some testimony from other witnesses who were in this general area as to what people were there. And in addition, we have other photographs. Marilyn Sitzman, for example, who was standing on the pedestal with Abraham Zapruder, told me that sitting on a park bench behind this small concrete wall were a young Negro couple in their late teens. However, she saw no one else, and that this Negro couple seemed to be simply innocently sitting there, and after the assassination, as many people did in a frightened state, ran away. Now, I'm interested in this one particular anomalous form. I don't claim that it's a recognizable human figure. All I claim is that it's an anomalous form along the fence line, about 15 feet down from the corner. Now, why I'm interested in this particular form is that its location fits in with a net of other evidence, which leads to exactly that same position. The testimony of at least 7 witnesses seeing a puff of smoke in that area, the testimony preeminently of S.M. Holland and witnesses Dodd and Simmons, who found curious circles of footprints, cigarette butts, and mud on a bumper immediately behind the fence at that point, again points to that general location. I attempted to determine whether this shape could be a function of the site, and by taking control shots from the same position as Mrs. Moorman occupied, determined that it could not be. Of course, the most interesting and perhaps the most critical piece of evidence here is actually the movement of the President's head under impact. And that movement, shocking, violent movement backwards and to the left, would accord with a shot fired from the general position of this anomalous shape along the fence.
Well, the thing that was interesting to me in a recent issue of the Los Angeles Free Press, in which Mr. Marcus put forward his theories on this photograph, he admitted that the photograph in question of the number 5 man, or the primary image that he gives a candidacy for as possibly a potential assassin, that this man could not have been firing the fatal shot, or the shot that impacted on the President's head at 3:12 or 3:13, because he projected both before the photograph and after the photograph what the particular movement and body stance of the person in question would be, this particular image. It seems to me that that's also applicable to your image. We see a hat or perhaps a head peering over a wall, but we don't see any gun, we don't see any rifle, at least. Aren't we really in the realm of speculation and second guessing here, or is that too harsh?
Yes, I don't see if clearly one could see a face and a hat and no gun, then quite obviously the figure there would not have been firing a weapon. However, I don't claim to see, even in the original photograph, under magnification, a human head or a face or a hat or really much of anything. I see an anomalous shape, and that shape could be a human face and a hat and a gun, or two of the three, or one of the three. I think simply on that point we don't have enough evidence to move to a conclusion on either side.
Speaking of the movement of the president's head, as seen in the, I believe it's the Zapruder film, you also indicate by your reproduction of frames of a motion picture film taken by a man by the name of Nix, I believe, the clear movement of the president's head by the calculations that you have made, by the sketches and diagrammatic aids that you use in the book, and I think it's very convincing. But it always seems to me to lead us back to the question of the autopsy, and you deal rather importantly with this. The conclusion of the autopsy surgeons at Bethesda Naval Hospital was that the president suffered a shot from above and behind, and that shot was the shot that caused the fatal injury and the shot that killed the president. I know many people have argued about the motion of the head, but it seems to me you advance the dialogue by addressing or confronting what the autopsy says, and you critique the autopsy with the film in mind, and yet you attempt to give a reconstruction that is not at odds or does not laugh off the autopsy conclusions or what have you. And I wonder if you could, in a way, recreate for us the conclusions you came to in the step-by-step reconstruction of the film and the autopsy findings, and how you attempted to mesh them.
Yes, I think the first thing to say about medical evidence with respect to the president's head injury is that one has an overlay of corroboration between the Parkland doctors and between the Bethesda autopsy report, but one also has a considerable area of conflict in that data. The description of the president's head wound, the best description we have, as given by Dr. McClellan, would indicate that the occipital and parietal bones were exploded outward, out the back of the president's head. This description by Dr. McClellan simply is not consistent with the description of the location of this small entry hole in the occiput, in the bone at the extreme rearmost point of the president's head. So what I've tried to do is to give both doctors, McClellan and his colleagues at Parkland Hospital, and also the doctors at Bethesda, a fair break, and believe that where we have disagreements or conflicts, it's due to disagreements of detail or location. And by weaving these two descriptions of the damage done to the president's head together, it's possible to detect two rather subtle patterns. One pattern indicating the more moderate damage done by a bullet striking the president in the back of the head, driving forwards, causing a back-to-front parasagittal laceration that is parallel to the midsection of the brain, causing certain damage over the left temple, certain damage behind the nose and in the globe of the right eye, depositing fragments in the right frontal sinus, damage of this sort. In addition, then by turning basically now to the reports of the Parkland surgeons, the reports of Dr. McClellan, of Dr. Jenkins, of Dr. Kemp Clark, one gets the impression of the much more destructive effect of a bullet impacting on the right temporal parietal region and exploding backwards over the back of the car. It seems to me actually one of the most significant facts with respect to reconstructing this double impact on the president's head, or whatever impact occurred on the president's head, is one small piece of bone that was discovered by a bystander the day after the assassination, some 25 feet to the south or left of the vehicle's direction of travel. Now, that piece of bone was taken to the pathologist at Methodist Hospital in Dallas, and it was identified as having come from the occipital region of the skull. This seems to me to be rather critical, because for a fragment of bone coming from the occiput, this bone which is located dead center in the back of the head, for a fragment to be blown 25 feet to the left simply does not seem in any way consistent with the impact of a bullet fired from directly behind on virtually a straight trajectory, only 6 degrees, blowing forward and thus blowing out the right top of the president's head. But this area of medical evidence is a very hazardous area in the extreme, mainly due to the vagueness of the autopsy report itself. As Dr. Cyril Weck, director of the Institute of Forensic Sciences, who wrote an appendix for this book, 6 Seconds in Dallas, as Dr. Weck pointed out, the brain examination was woefully incomplete. As far as Dr. Weck can find, no examination was made of the left cerebral hemisphere. No coronal sections were taken, which is certainly a rather unusual procedure, and this rather vagueness with respect to the head injury haunts that whole autopsy report. So I think we have to deal with this medical evidence within the most stringent limits and not try to push the evidence too far. I'm happy to say only that a study of the medical evidence is consistent with the view that 2 bullets struck the president from opposite directions, that this evidence in and of itself does not falsify that theory.
I had an opportunity to interview Dr. Weck with reference to my documentary, and one of the questions I put to him was whether he accepted the existence in the back of the head of a small entrance wound, as discovered by Doctors Fink and Boswell. And also, with reference to this wound, Dr. Weck said, yes, if you are going to accept the autopsy, you must accept the existence of this small wound, a neat wound, a wound that had a coning effect, a beveling effect. Do you feel, on the basis of your research, that this wound is mistakenly placed, or that it doesn't exist, or that it's incorrectly characterized in the autopsy?
Well, quite clearly, there's a conflict between the description of the back of the president's head as given by the Parkland surgeons, which indicated that the parietal and occipital bones were sprung open and blown open to such an extent and to such a low point that cerebellar tissue was protruding. Certainly, there's an obvious conflict between this description of the back of the president's head and the description given by the Bethesda surgeons, who indicated that there was this small entrance hole 2.5 centimeters to the right and slightly above the external occipital protuberance. In other words, almost dead center and a little bit to the right of this occipital bone. There is a conflict here. It seems to me that at one's most extreme hazard does one move to the position of saying that any government investigator lied about evidence, lied about what the evidence was, or fiddled the evidence. For example, I think one of the strongest indications of the impact of a bullet from behind, and incidentally, it seems to me there's much more evidence of the impact of a bullet from the front on the president's head than there is of one from behind. But I think one of the strongest pieces of evidence is the existence of these 2 fragments, ballistically matched to Oswald's rifle, found in the front seat of the limousine. because I can't account for how they got into the limousine except through an impact on the president's head. Now, for the critic, and critics have suggested this, that these fragments were planted by governmental agents, since the car was in government hands after the assassination. This throws, to suggest this sort of thing, throws the whole investigation into paralysis, it seems to me. Because at that point, it becomes impossible to disjoin the good evidence, the clean evidence, from the dirty evidence. In other words, one has then no longer any criteria for distinguishing between evidence one wants to base conclusions on and evidence which one wants to throw away as false trails. And it seems to me that a logical consequence of doing that at any point in the study of this whole case is to announce that one has ended one study, because logically one can't proceed any farther. So that's the background to why, given very problematical circumstances and very problematical evidence surrounding the existence of this small hole in the president's head, namely that none of the FBI or Secret Service agents present at the autopsy, nor any of the Parkland doctors who examined the back of the president's head at Parkland Hospital, stated that they saw this hole.
Well, is it crucial that the Parkland doctors didn't see it? After all, the president supposedly was not turned over for any kind of detailed examination at Parkland Hospital.
No, it's not critical. It's ancillary. But it is rather unusual that, for example, Dr. Kemp Clark, the neurosurgeon attending, the only neurosurgeon actually to see the president's head, a skilled surgeon, would not have detected a bullet entry hole somewhat below the massive defect on the right side of the president's head. This is curious to me. Also curious, and even more curious, is the fact that none of the people present at the autopsy, with the exception of the autopsy surgeons who declared the existence of this hole in their report, none of these other people saw the hole. So, in spite of the fact that we have this problematical evidence surrounding the existence of this hole, and in spite of the simplification of the whole theory that would eventuate from neglecting it, it seems to me we have to go along with it and continue to believe in its existence.
You mentioned the bullet fragments earlier that were found in the limousine, and you suggested correctly that a number of the critics have said that these may have been planted fragments, and Mr. Marcus, in his study, The Bastard Bullet, gives us the possibility that Commission Exhibit 399, the one whole, pristine, and almost intact bullet, conceivably was a plant. I was under the impression, Dr. Thompson, in an article, or rather in a letter to the New York Review of Books in 1966, that you at one time held a similar position, and that you have modified your position in your new book, 6 Seconds in Dallas. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. As I say in my book, I earlier had adopted what I call the Popkin theory. I had found that Professor Popkin here on the West Coast had introduced this in his study in the New York Review. And at that time, it seemed to me that there was very good warrant for believing in the plant theory of Commission Exhibit 399. I still think there is a good warrant for believing in the plant theory for 399. I think there's an alternative theory which I'm inclined to accept now, but I accept it with no great enthusiasm. There are great problems with it. What inclines me to believe that 399 really was involved in the assassination is the joining of two rather atypical circumstances. 399 is a very atypical bullet. In fact, any bullet fired from Oswald's rifle at normal muzzle velocity seemed to get deformed when it hit anything. Even the ballistic comparison rounds appeared to be deformed along a longitudinal axis. This bullet is just slightly squeezed along the tail. I examined it in the archives. A very atypical projectile. And given, too, the descriptions of the president's back wound that comes from the Bethesda autopsy surgeons on the night of the 22nd, which we find in the Siebert O'Neill report, that's a very atypical wound. bullets simply do not penetrate only 1.5 or so inches into flesh. This is a very strange and peculiar sort of situation. And yet, as one studies the rest of the evidence surrounding this, I'm driven to believe that the autopsy doctors were correct, that the wound did only penetrate that far. Now, if that's the case, it seemed to me the simplest thing was to simply join these two very atypical pieces of evidence and join them under the hypothesis that .399 was fired from Oswald's rifle, we know that, and was fired from the rifle as it was located on the 6th floor of the depository, but was fired at less than normal muzzle velocity, was the product rather of a short charge, that is, a defective cartridge. We know the ammunition is 19 years old, and thus is rather unreliable in 1963 or even more today. This would match with some rather fragmentary reports we have from the witnesses present in Dealey Plaza, namely that the first shot had a firecracker pop sound. Many Secret Service agents indicated that it didn't have the sharp crack of a rifle. Now we're nearing. I mean, and you've picked, I think, a point in my reconstruction, which is very near the periphery of the case, where I'm more and more unsure of my ground, when I'm much more willing to entertain alternative hypotheses and things of this sort. But it seems to me that by joining all these atypical phenomena together under one hypothesis, one gets a sounder theory than by postulating that .399 was not involved in the assassination attempt at all. Then, of course, one has to account for whatever bullet struck the president in the back. One has to find that bullet. It doesn't seem to be available. One has to go on to explain why it didn't penetrate any farther, etc., etc. One has difficulties if one rejects this theory and buys the plant theory. But I'm very hesitant at this point in this whole area.
Curtis Crawford, on my broadcast, felt that with reference to the location of the back wound, we didn't have a mistake. We had either a lie or we had the truth. Do you think that is too strong a statement? I would gather from what you said that the back wound may have been mistakenly placed. Mr. Crawford was not persuaded that it was. He felt that Commander Humes had been rather consistent in the past couple of years with reference to that, and was again so on the CBS inquiry. And the reason I was especially anxious to get your opinion on the location of the back wound is that I gather from your book that you've had an opportunity to have conversations with Dr. Boswell, and I wondered if he had elucidated anything on the position or location of the back wound.
Well, Dr. Boswell didn't tell me anything that he had not already told other reporters. He claims that he mistakenly placed the back wound on the autopsy face sheet, Commissioning Exhibit 397, in a position that was somewhat lower than its actual position. This contention of Dr. Boswell troubles me immensely for a number of reasons. First of all, this back wound is the only wound on that face sheet which seems to be mislocated. All the other wounds seem to have been located in their proper positions which agree with the autopsy face sheet, and, with the official autopsy report. In addition, of course, the lower, mistaken now, location of the back wound matches the location of the wound as described by the Secret Service and FBI agents who saw the president's body at Bethesda Naval Hospital, and also matches the location of holes in the president's clothing. Thus, Dr. Boswell's so-called mistaken location of this wound seems to be a rather amazing coincidence that his mistaken location lines up with all these other points. Dr. Cyril Weck of Pittsburgh, pointed out a most interesting point. Pointed out that Dr. Humes, Dr. Boswell, and other doctors have all agreed that they hazarded the opinion on the night of the 22nd that the bullet had been forced out of the back wound during external cardiac massage. Now, Dr. Weck points out that external cardiac massage is impressed on the breastbone in front, a bone which would be approximately directly opposite the lower location of the back wound, and thus would be a reasonable grounds for accounting for a bullet being forced out of the back at that location. What he asks, though, is that how Dr. Humes would explain the fact that if the wound is really located in the neck, then how external cardiac massage impressed on the breastbone would in any plausible fashion force out a bullet out of the neck.
Yes, indeed.
And Dr. Weck thinks that this is a very critical point. I'm inclined to agree with him. I think he's caught something very significant.
You make reference in your book, giving Dr. Boswell as your authority, to an additional autopsy descriptive face sheet prepared during the autopsy. Can you tell us anything about that?
Yes. I asked Dr. Boswell how the autopsy surgeons knew when they waited around later to write their official report some 2 days later that the location of the occipital wound in the president's head was 2.5 centimeters to the right and slightly above, etc., since that was not marked on any of the papers available to us. He thought for a moment and then replied, "Oh, that was marked on the other autopsy face sheet." Well, this was the first anyone had heard of another autopsy face sheet similar to the one that's preserved as Commission Exhibit 397. He indicated that measurement was noted on that face sheet, as well as such other information as the color of the president's eyes, things of this sort. He indicated that as far as he knew, this second autopsy face sheet simply had been lost at some point.
I wonder if we could turn to the Zapruder motion picture film, which occupies a large portion of your book. One of the things that was especially instructive to me yesterday at your press conference here in Los Angeles was something that you had characterized in your book rather well, but which didn't come alive, as it were, for me until I heard you express it. And you differed, I thought, from someone such as Raymond Marcus, who has spoken on the Zapruder film to our audiences at Pacifica. You characterized the clutching motion, or what had been previously described as the clutching movement of the president's hands as seen in the Zapruder film after the car emerges from behind the limousine, that is from Abraham Zapruder's point of view. You did not characterize this as a clutching motion. I think many people heretofore have been persuaded that the president at that point had already sustained a wound in his throat and in some sort of protective reaction was attempting to reach for his throat where he'd already been wounded. Am I correct in thinking then that the president, in your opinion, has not sustained a wound in the front of his throat at that point, but is displaying a rather different reaction?
Yes, my curiosity was excited by a conversation with Marilyn Sitzman and William and Gail Newman, two witnesses who were very close to the president at the time he was hit. And they indicated to me that his hand seemed to come up in a spasmodic gesture as if to protect his face, and they were not aware of any clutching movement. So at that point I went back and studied with great care the Zapruder film at Life. At the time I was a consultant to Life, and determined that actually as the president's hands come up, his fists are clenched, that his hands go up beyond neck level. They come up to about nose level and are clutched in a violent sort of spasmodic movement. But as one studies this movement, it becomes apparent rather quickly that it's not a clutching movement at the throat.
He's not reaching for his throat.
No, that it's a rather hunching movement of the shoulders and the elbows splayed upward with the fists clenched.
Yes, I see.
And personally, I don't know as to whether this sort of spasmodic movement would be more consistent with a transiting shot through the neck or with a shot which simply struck in the back and lodged there. I think on points of this sort we have no science, but I don't think it's any evidence whatsoever for the existence of a transiting shot. I mean, it's not a contraindication to the fact that the shot lodged in the back.
But you had already concluded that the wound in the front of the president's throat was indeed caused not by a bullet transiting from back to front, but was rather caused by a bullet fragment or a bone fragment resulting from the fatal headshot. Is that correct? Yes,
other evidence, the examination of the president's shirt and tie, a host of medical notes from Parkland Hospital indicated to me a vertical channel of laceration up and down the president's neck. This combined with a small laceration in the midbrain and the left cerebral peduncle indicated to me the possibility that this explosive impact on the president's head might have sent force and fragments downward there to bruise the larynx, nick the trachea on the right anterior side, interestingly enough, and then exit through a small 3 to 5 millimeter hole before causing a vertical rip in the shirt. This seemed to me to be a more adequate hypothesis to account for this curious and curiously small hole in the front of the president's throat.
Haven't you been subjected to rather scathing criticism then for the positing of what the press describes as a conscience-stricken souvenir hunter as the agent to transfer the bullet which has fallen out of the president's back to be transferred onto a stretcher that might possibly, or perhaps you don't agree with this, might possibly have held Governor Conley?
Well, I think one goes to the facts and then one tries to explain the facts. The fact seems to me that the stretcher on which the bullet was found most likely did not belong to Governor Conley, that it was a stretcher completely unconnected with the case and may have been the stretcher used in the treatment of a 2.5-year-old Negro child who had been injured about the same time. It's very difficult to account for how a bullet ballistically matched to Oswald's rifle would manage to find its way to a stretcher unconnected with the case. And the hypothesis which I entertain in the most gentle terms is that someone may have picked this bullet up out of the president's clothing where it lodged after it had been forced out of his back, or in the floor of Trauma Room 1. Have been picked up perhaps as a souvenir. We know that the governor's undershirt, for example, disappeared for over a year due to a souvenir hunter. And I hypothesize that this souvenir hunter may have quickly realized the enormity of his find, the personal jeopardy that he was in, and quickly secreted it on this stretcher. The stretcher was along the path of people, some 20 people who were in Trauma Room 1 with the president, on their way as they left that to go into the elevator, to go down, to leave the area, and to have coffee. I think this is not a tremendously probable hypothesis, but in some of these areas, it's almost the case that we have no plausible hypotheses, and I think this is one of them.
I wonder if you would give us your thinking on the theory of an early hit, that is, the possibility as suggested by the CBS News inquiry in 1967 that the president may have sustained a hit much earlier than you or the commission concluded, or rather I should say somewhat earlier than you or the commission concluded he was indeed hit. And this theory has been alternately suggested by certain of the critics. It has the virtue, from the standpoint of those who are defending the lone assassin hypothesis, of giving sufficient time in some instances between the shot that hit the president demonstrably and a second shot that presumably hits Governor Conley for the first time.
Well, this is a very complicated point. One has to discriminate between the hypothesis that has the first shot fired early and hits the president and the first shot fired early which misses the president. The CBS documentary based its conclusion upon the so-called jiggle theory of the assassination, that certain jiggles in the Zapruder film could be correlated as startle reactions on Zapruder's part and could be correlated with bullet noises, some 4 to 5 frames after a bullet had been fired, then the film would jiggle. Well, CBS found a jiggle at Zapruder frames 190, and thus concluded that a shot may have been fired at 186. But what CBS did not tell its viewers was that there was a similar jiggle of the same character but of greater magnitude at Zapruder frame 197, only 1/3 of a second later, and that there was an additional jiggle at Zapruder frame 210, and that at other points in the film there are also jiggles. This theory actually was discussed at Life over a year ago and rejected, I think, with sound warrant. The jiggles are most likely due to imperfections in the machining of the parts in the camera, which permit the film to move forward and away from the lens, thus making certain frames very clear and other frames somewhat unclear. I don't think then that evidence, the jiggle theory, the so-called jiggles, is any evidence of an early hit. Now, I believe Ray Marcus here on the coast has tried to correlate the first shot with a movement of Mrs. Kennedy's head, a turn on her part towards her husband shortly after the first shot. I actually, from my viewing of the Zapruder film, I find Mrs. Kennedy has made that turn by Zapruder frame 183. So that would indicate that if she's turning in reaction to a shot, that the shot must have been fired way back at 150 even, or even earlier. Mrs. Kennedy's testimony, of course, on this point is quite ambiguous. If one reads carefully her testimony, it's not clear whether she's saying that she turned right after the first shot, or perhaps just before the president was struck in the head, because her language indicates that she recognizes, is cognizant of the turn at just about the same time that she sees her husband's head explode.
Well, can't one say, perhaps, Dr. Thompson, that some of the recollections of the occupants of the limousine are faulty to the extent that the Zapruder film seems to contradict their recollection of the event, that their recollection has grown cloudy or confused? If that's the case with Mrs. Kennedy, if indeed she did not turn immediately after hearing a shot, isn't it also possible that Governor Connolly or Mrs. Connolly is mistaken as to their total recall, as it were?
Well, surely Governor Connolly and Mrs. Connolly and all the witnesses in Dealey Plaza who spoke to the point and felt the governor was hit by the second shot, all these witnesses could be wrong, and we would still have the Zapruder film, and we would have on that film the very remarkable discontinuity that occurs at Zapruder frame 238, and which Raymond Marcus here on the West Coast discovered. This sudden drop in the shoulder, the puff in the cheeks, the disarrangement of the hair. Mr. Marcus can find even other indices of this, which I have been unable to find in my study of the film. Putting all these memories aside, one still has the unambiguous witness of the Zapruder film that after the president was struck, after he is reacting to a bullet hit, some 14 frames, 14/18ths of a second after he's been hit, we see the immediate momentum transfer effects of a bullet driving into the governor's back, compressing his chest wall and forcing air up into his cheeks and finally out his mouth. This seems to be an unambiguous witness, and surely the final and complete death of the single bullet theory.
Did you conclude that the president's head motion was in no way related to a neuromuscular reaction, or or related perhaps to some kind of a propping up gesture of support by Mrs. Kennedy?
Yes, and not only that, but by an acceleration or deceleration of the car. There are various hypotheses that could account for this kind of a movement. For example, I checked the velocity of the car and found it to be constant over this time interval in question. Mrs. Kennedy clearly couldn't have grabbed her husband and wrenched him over in 1/18th of a second, and her testimony is that she regretted very much not having grabbed her husband before the impact of the fatal shots. The neuromuscular question is much more subtle and much more complicated. Here one has to turn, I think, most eminently to the acceleration curves of this double violent movement, because they're rather sharp. One finds a sudden acceleration forwards and then an equally sharp acceleration backwards, an even greater acceleration backwards and to the left, an acceleration which is terminated, which has completed itself in 2/18 of a second. Now, this seems to be the most unambiguous witness that what we are seeing are two radically opposite impressed forces acting on the head. I mean, the profile of accelerations are the profile that one would get from a double impact, from one billiard ball hitting another, for example. A neuromuscular reflex action would take longer, first of all, and the acceleration curves would be much shallower. In other words, it would take longer for the muscles of the neck and shoulder girdle to stop the head under this gigantic forward acceleration, bring it to a halt, and then reverse its direction. But again, no possible studies, of course, could have been done on a question of this sort. And I think we're left as we're left in so many aspects of this case, with probabilities and improbabilities. In this case, I think it's highly improbable.
I wonder if you could tell us in the time remaining about the dent in one of the cartridge cases found on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository after the assassination. I thought it was one of the most fascinating points in your book.
Well, thank you. This was one of the most gratifying parts of my research. After the main contours of the reconstruction had composed themselves, it became apparent to me that there was one conflict, namely that the main contours of the theory indicated that 2 shots came from the Texas School Book Depository window, whereas 3 cartridge cases were found up there. So I began looking at the evidence surrounding those cartridge cases and found a rather interesting group of anomalies concerning one of the cases. One of these cases had a dented tip to such a degree that in its present state it could not hold a projectile or fired a projectile on November 22nd. I investigated various possibilities as to how this tip could have been dented after firing. Could it have been stepped on? Well, the dent itself was of such narrowness, only about 1/16, 1/8 of an inch, that it seemed to have been incurred by some sharp metal object rather than the soft and rather flat surface of a shoe. I asked Luke Mooney, who found the cartridge cases, whether he had stepped on them or anyone else had stepped on them, and he was offended as could be and said, "No, of course, sir. I took all due precautions and did not step on these and made sure they were not stepped on." Could it have been dented in being ejected from the rifle and having hit the wall? Well, I threw some cartridges against a similar brick wall, and these cartridges are of rather solid brass and do not dent in such an impact. Then I began looking more closely at the other marks and lacks of marks which were on this particular cartridge case, and found a number of anomalies, certain things that were on this cartridge case that were not on the other 2 cases or the live round. The most interesting thing I discovered actually at the National Archives, which I hadn't found any mention of in any of the documents in the archives or in the 26 volumes. I discovered it while supervising the photographing of these exhibits for life. On the live round found in the rifle and on the 2 cartridge cases on Commission Exhibits 544 and 45, there were 2 narrow chambering dents along the side of the casing, whereas on this curious dented projectile there was no such mark. This seemed odd to me. If all cartridge cases and the live round had in fact been in Oswald's rifle, so I pursued it and looked at the 2 cases which had been test-fired in Oswald's rifle, and found on one of the test cases clearly exactly the same dent of the same magnitude, on the other case a similar dent but of much smaller magnitude. I then hypothesized that that very likely this dent was a anomaly introduced by the chamber of Oswald's rifle, and that thus what I discovered was the likelihood that this particular cartridge, 543, may never have been in a fired state in the chamber of Oswald's rifle.
Well, didn't Mr. Weisberg conclude that some of the ammunition rounds or live rounds discovered on the Texas School Book Depository, the 6th floor, that they had perhaps been loaded into other weapons other than Oswald's rifle? Is my recollection correct in that?
It may be correct. I couldn't confirm it. I simply don't know of what you speak.
You worked with a research team of Life magazine. What caused them to abort or discontinue their investigation of the assassination?
I don't know. With an organization of that size and magnitude, I don't think any of the Indians know why the chiefs make the decisions they do.
Can you tell us, in your view now that your book is out, you've completed your research, what do you see ahead in terms of the movement for a new investigation of the assassination? What can we expect, perhaps?
Well, I hope one critical thing will occur shortly, and as you may know, Life magazine is making an attempt to enjoin distribution of this book.
Why is that?
They claim that the sketches that we used in this book, sketches which depict the events on the Zapruder film, infringe their copyright on the film. Of course, at an earlier point, we made every effort to get permission to use the film itself, which would have been eminently more helpful than the sketches that we evidently had to use. But were refused, and finally at one point offered to turn the whole book over to Life, to turn over all commercial interest in the book to Life in exchange for getting these frames into the public domain. We were refused, and at that point went ahead with sketches. When the book came out, I then urged Life, and have been urging them now for some month, to release these critical frames, because they show things which are simply invisible on the on the copy of the film seen by the Commission. This is a tremendous piece of evidence and should be released so that people can verify whether it exists or not. I say it does. I work for them. But I think all your listeners, and you too, should have a chance to see this. Well, Life replied to my appeal some 2 weeks ago by bringing suit against Random House, against my publisher, and against me, asking a judge to enjoin distribution and publication of the book and have all copies of the book that were then available impounded and destroyed. And we're, at the present time, fighting that suit. Our attorneys are very confident that in the many years' time that the suit will be won, but it's a very ugly and costly business.
Do you plan any further research into the assassination? Are you involved in any new projects in that regard?
No, I'm tired. And I've seen this like a football game in many ways, that an individual picks up the ball and runs with it for a certain amount of time, and then someone else picks it up. For example, I've worked on the shoulders of many researchers all over the country, and this book stands on the shoulders of their work. And I would hope now that new people would appear to stand on our shoulders and to move the thing further. But I'm rather tired right now.
Well, Dr. Thompson, you've been running very hard with the ball, as it were, for almost an hour in our interview now, and I want to thank you for coming to Pacifica and talking with us. Where do you go from Los Angeles on your travels now?
To Chicago, and then to Washington, and then back to Haverford to teach on the 3rd of January.
Well, we've enjoyed talking with you, and I hope it won't be the last time, at least on your next visit to California. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bill.